Let's bring in the president of the Council on Foreign Relations and the author of the book, The World, A Brief Introduction, Richard Haass, also staff writer at The Atlantic magazine. Anne Applebaum, she's the author of the book, Twilight of Democracy, The Seductive Allure of Authoritarianism. Hey, Richard, I remember more than one time Dr. Brzezinski, after he got past calling me stunningly superficial, would get Pulitzer Prize winners and foreign policy thinkers on this show and mock them for saying, oh, Pakistan wants to be like the United States, or, oh, so-and-so wants to be more like the United States. And Dr. Brzezinski would always say you have to look at what the leaders in that country want for their country, what they need for their country. And often it's radically at odds with what the United States wants for their own. So I ask you the question we've been talking about around this table this morning. Why does it benefit Vladimir Putin to play by the rules? He's done pretty damn well over the past 21 years, making up his own rules, breaking them, and creating a new set of rules, while one American president after another spends 4 to 8 years chasing him around.
Absolutely. And I think one should never forget that Vladimir Putin's principal purpose is to remain in power. His goal is to remain the leader of Russia for as long as he continues to breathe. That's it. So he's not interested in becoming more like us or more open. He's not even interested in developing a real modern economy, because that could set in motion trends economically and politically that can threaten his domination of the country. So that's what we have to understand. We're not going to change. He's not going to democratize. He will pay a price for keeping political prisoners in prison. His principal role and goal is to stay in power. Now, where he might be willing to compromise are things that are not central to that. For example, all the cyber attacks on the United States, the ransomware, that's a useful tool to prod us, but that is not directly tied to his maintenance of power. So I think the Biden administration going into the summit needs to distinguish where are the areas we could potentially move Putin, where are the areas we're simply banging our head against the wall.
As we watch Vladimir Putin's plane arrive in Geneva, and everybody is looking at their watches, their Swiss watches, to see if he is lined up to be on time for the summit meeting. Anne Applebaum, I want to ask you,
and he is.
What is for Joe Biden, for the West, what is a successful outcome to this summit?
I think a successful outcome is when either Biden whispers in his ear or says so clearly after the press conference that there are limits to what we will tolerate. There are limits to what we will tolerate in terms of repression of dissidents, in terms of using Russian hackers to attack the United States, in terms of allowing ransomware criminals to attack American pipelines from a base inside Russia. And it may be that we have to say some things clearly. Look, here are what the consequences will be if you do X or Y. Here's our strategy going forward. I would add also to what Richard Haass just said, a really important element to understand about Putin is absolutely he's right that what he really wants and his main concern is to stay in power. But part of how he defines staying in power is he believes that he also needs to undermine democracy, not just democracy in specific, but in general, the idea of it. He needs the Russians to believe that there's no alternative to him. And so much of what he does, whether it's intervening in U.S. elections or whether it's supporting extremist leaders all over Europe and indeed all over the world, a lot of that is designed to make sure that there is a constant level of chaos outside of Russia so that Russians will continue to support him. And that is also something about him that's not going to go away. His dislike of democracy and his dislike of us isn't nationalist, it's ideological. And we need to understand that, and we need to have a very clear response to it.
Richard, we've been talking this morning about the urgency of President Biden to show consequences, that there will be consequences for, say, shutting down the largest oil pipeline in the United States that feeds the entire East Coast, or a meat processing plant, or go down to the hospital, go down the list. What does that deterrence look like, though, to Vladimir Putin? It hasn't been sanctions up to this point. Is it turning out the lights in Moscow? What does that mean as a practical question to show that there will be consequences?
Wish I had a better answer for you, Willie. Yes, there's potentially more sanctions against Putin's inner circle, conceivably more draconian economic sanctions. The problem with turning the lights out in Moscow is that in an unrestrained or unconstrained cyber conflict between the two countries, we've got an enormous amount to lose. Unlike nuclear weapons, or almost like nuclear weapons, cyber can become a weapon of mass destruction. We're extremely vulnerable. So yeah, we can hurt Russia. That's no doubt. But in turn, they can really hurt us. So we have got to be extremely careful about essentially going into an unrestrained, unregulated cyber escalation with them. I would think one other thing we could do, though, is put out certain information. And I don't know exactly what we have, but the more details we can put out about corruption, about privatization of wealth for Mr. Putin and his buddies to embarrass him at home, I would make that a priority.
And you talked there, and to follow up kind of on what Willie was saying, when we talk about whispering into Putin's ear that there are limits, that there are red lines, as Joe Biden has already said, what do you think are the retaliatory measures that the United States could and would take against Putin that Biden can kind of follow up that whisper with? If you do X, we will do Y. What's the Y?
If you harm or kill another dissident, we will quadruple our support for Russian dissidents abroad.